Ever wondered what else was going on in the year you were born? You may have heard about some of it from your parents or radio or television, but you've never seen all of it collected together in one programme. 1982 was the year of the Falklands War, when Britain recaptured the islands in the South Atlantic that had been invaded by Argentina. It was also the year when Channel 4 started, when the future king, Prince William, was born, and when Pope John Paul became the first pope in 450 years to visit Britain. One thing you would have recognised was News at 10, which was reporting on all these events every night. So let's go back to the year that you were born.
The Argentine flag was raised on South Georgia in March 1982. Less than a month later, what had started as a diplomatic skirmish ended in open conflict when a full-scale Argentine force invaded the Falkland Islands. Immediately, Britain began to assemble the biggest military task force since the Second World War, a fleet of more than 100 ships. Even luxury liners were commandeered from civilian cruises. The mood was happy. No one really believed it would come to a fight. Just in case, on the long voyage south, the men prepared themselves with target practice and fitness training. The Argentine leader, General Galtieri, had liberated the Malvinas after 150 years of British rule. South Georgia was soon back in British hands, but it was clear that Argentina would not give up more without a real fight. The first major casualty of the war was the Argentine ship the Belgrano. She was torpedoed and sunk. 360 died. On the 4th of May, Argentina's revenge. An Exocet missile attack on HMS Sheffield cost 20 British lives. The first main British landing on the islands was in San Carlos water on the 21st of May. Incredibly, they were given 9 precious hours to establish a bridgehead before the first Argentine airstrike. The stretch of water became known as Bomb Alley. One hit HMS Antelope, but didn't explode until later that night. Just over a week later, the parachute regiment took Goose Green. The young Argentine conscripts looked relieved it was all over. Colonel H. Jones of the Paras was killed in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. He was awarded a posthumous V.C. The Falklands were the first wartime test for the Harriers. Heavily outnumbered, they flew more than 1,000 missions. The Argentine air attack on Bluff Cove took everyone by surprise. HMS Sir Galahad suffered a direct hit. Troops and crew jumped for their lives. Royal Naval's Sea King and Wessex helicopter pilots flew completely blind into the dense smoke. The survivors scrambled ashore in lifeboats, some severely injured, and 50 died that day. Then came the main assault on Port Stanley. British forces had marched, yomping they called it, 70 miles across country to take the town. the news spread across the islands that the town had fallen.
There is a white flag flying over Stanley. Very marvellous.
General Jeremy Moore, commander of the British land forces, apologised to the islanders for taking so long to come. Formal surrender was on the 14th of June. It had cost 255 British lives, 777 Argentine lives. But the homecoming would never be forgotten. Thousand Jewish settlers in a corner of the Sinai Desert being evicted by Israeli troops as part of a peace deal with Egypt. The troops went on to bulldoze or blow up the town. But peace in the Sinai left Israel clear to attack the Palestine Liberation Organization in the north. In June, Israeli tanks invaded Lebanon. The aim was to push the PLO back 25 miles from the Israeli border, but it rapidly escalated into one of the biggest conflicts of 1982. The Israelis bombarded PLO strongholds like Tyre and Sidon, then attacked Syrian missile bases and planes to keep them out of the war. 80 Syrian planes were shot down. Finally, the Israeli army advanced to the Lebanese capital of Beirut.
But the conflict was entering its bloodiest stage. The Israelis struck the PLO at their heart, Beirut. The Israelis claimed they were aiming only at PLO fire positions. The siege of West Beirut was to last 10 weeks. $800 US Marines went into Beirut with French and Italian troops as a peacekeeping force, while the PLO pulled out of the city to a reckless farewell salute.
But the PLO leader Yasser Arafat soon won a propaganda victory when the world learned of a massacre in Beirut. And Israelis themselves protested against the news that hundreds of Palestinian refugees had been killed in camps controlled by their army. They blamed their Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who was forced to hold a government inquiry. Much happier news was the visit to Britain by Pope John Paul. It came at the height of the Falklands War, and the Pope said prayers for the victims of the war on both sides. Huge crowds gathered wherever the Pope went, even if they couldn't always hear him. The problem here at Westminster Cathedral was a faulty sound system. He saw the Queen, rebuilding bridges that were destroyed when her ancestor, Henry VIII, broke away from the Catholic Church 400 years earlier. And that was emphasised even more strongly when he went to Canterbury and prayed alongside the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie.
My deep desire, my ardent hope and prayer is that my visit may serve the cause of Christian unity. I believe in you. I believe in all mankind. I believe in the unique dignity of every human being.
Other people who made headlines included the Pope's fellow Pole, Lech Wałęsa, released after nearly a year in detention, but his independent union Solidarity was banned. President Reagan came to Britain and went riding with the Queen. He also became the first American president to address a joint session of Parliament. Another visitor was the new German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who by the end of the 80s would see East and West Germany reunited. But one of Russia's most conservative leaders, Leonid Brezhnev, died this year after 18 years in charge of the Soviet Union. The end of the road too for DeLorean cars. The Belfast factory was closed and John DeLorean himself was arrested on charges of drug dealing. Laker Airways, Britain's first cut-price airline, collapsed. Its founder, Sir Freddie Laker, had launched SkyTrain 5 years earlier, when his first one-way flight from Gatwick to New York cost £59. The Social Democrat leader, Roy Jenkins, won his party's only by-election triumph at Hill Head. But there was much bickering with his Liberal partners in the alliance over the carve-up of seats. Michael Fagan managed to break into the Queen's bedroom at Buckingham Palace. Only when he asked for a cigarette was she able to summon help. The Queen had a new grandson this year, Prince William, the first child of the Prince and Princess of Wales and future heir to the throne. And Mrs. Thatcher's children were in the news. Mark went missing in Africa for 2 days while taking part in the Paris to Dakar rally. His broken-down car was eventually spotted by a search plane. And Carol took a job as a radio phone-in presenter. She said she was happy to discuss politics, but the only Thatcher she spoke for was herself, not the rest of the family.
Those were the major things that happened in the year you were born, but down here in the ITN film vaults, there's much more. Like, who were the big names in sport? What scientific discoveries were being made? What was fashionable? And what was making people laugh? Some things will seem very familiar, some very different. So let's go back and take a closer look.
1982 was the year of the Rebel Cricket Tour of South Africa. 15 English players, including Geoffrey Boycott and Graham Gooch, faced the first South African side for over a decade. The Rebels were banned from international cricket for 3 years. 2 Rebels from the tennis world slogged it out in the men's final at Wimbledon. Jimmy Connors beat John McEnroe in what turned out to be Connors' last Wimbledon victory. Aston Villa's Peter With, helped by a friendly goalpost, made sure that England's habit of winning the European Cup continued. And the European Athletics Championship was won by Daley Thompson, who beat the world record for the decathlon by 58 points. Sebastian Coe had the unusual experience of losing in Athens. But Steve Cram strode into the record books with wins in the European and Commonwealth Games. An unusual revival from the 19th century was the 6-day race in Nottingham. The object? To run as far as possible in 6 consecutive days. Some found they needed company over the long haul. The winner was Tom O'Reilly from Solihull, who managed 577 miles, still a long way off the record set 100 years ago of 623 miles. One award-winning marathon runner who was banned this year was 11-year-old Cheryl Page. Even though she'd won 120 medals in Germany, the Amateur Athletics Association ruled that she was too young to take part in the London Marathon.
I think whereas I've ran 2 marathons and also I have been building up for 6 years, I think that it is a bit unfair.
But she was allowed to join 1,500 other contestants in the Abingdon Marathon, where she managed to shave 40 minutes off her previous best time. There was disappointment for amateur jockey Geraldine Rees, who failed in her attempt to become the first woman to complete the Grand National. But cricketing history was made by Sarah Potter, daughter of Dennis Potter, the playwright, when she turned out for the Hereford second 11. and women were even breaking into the fire brigade. Susan Batten was the first woman in Britain to take and pass the rigorous training course. Among other things, she had to be 5'7" tall and run 100 yards with a 12-stone man on her shoulders. She surprised the fire chiefs by her success.
Now up a bit.
It's been worthwhile so far, and I hope it's going to carry on and be more so.
Are you tough enough for the job?
Must be, yes.
Well, what about prejudice? Do you think there'll be prejudice at fire stations where you're working?
I've been surprised so far how much help and encouragement I've got.
Svetlana Savitskaya became only the second Russian woman to fly into space in 19 years. Her boss said doctors wanted to check how a member of the weaker sex coped with stress. But he quickly changed his mind and said women were better in experiments demanding fine and punctual work. America's space shuttle Columbia was launching its first commercial satellite.
Which I did get the out on the direction motors to change on 207, but even my...
One of the four-man crew watched as the satellite spun like a top for stability, then explosive bolts released springs which sent it catapulting into space. It had its own onboard rocket motor to send it into orbit.
Okay, the port restraint is on. Here comes the spin. Here it goes. Yeah, we see it down here, Bill. It's beautiful.
The way was now clear for satellite television, and the government gave the go-ahead for the first direct broadcasting service. By the end of the decade, there were to be small rooftop dishes, with each customer having a decoder to unscramble the signal and thus stop piracy. The government also allowed cable TV to operate more widely, giving viewers access to up to 50 television channels. That would be in the future, but Britain's fourth channel had already arrived.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be able to say to you, welcome to Channel 4.
And for the first time, there was an alternative telephone system. Mercury was launched by a consortium of 3 big companies, using fibre optic cable along railway lines. Each line could carry up to 2,000 calls between Britain's main business centres, as well as providing computer services and video pictures. And it was business on Saturdays for Barclays, the first time one of the main high street banks had opened its doors on Saturday morning for 13 years. Bank staff complained, but customers seemed to like it.
Thanks very much indeed. Fine. Okay.
Plans were announced for a new £1 coin to replace the old pound note. The coins were more expensive to produce, but lasted longer. And another coin that went into circulation for the first time was the 20p piece. For £2, you could buy a pound of Limeswold, Britain's first new cheese for 300 years. It was twice as dear as cheddar, but designed to take some business back from the French. The dairy industry's next coup was to sell milk in pubs. The pinter with the difference was tested out in the Midlands, because milk consumption had fallen by 10% in 7 years. Some customers were more appreciative than others. The Welsh Dry Sunday was put to the test in a referendum to decide whether pubs could open on the Sabbath. Only 12% of Welsh people lived in the 9 dry districts, mainly Welsh-speaking. In the end, 4 of those decided to go wet, allowing pubs to open on Sunday for the first time in a century. The London wine bar of Elvino's, a favourite haunt of lawyers and journalists, was taken to court by 2 women who won the right to buy a drink at the bar. Up until then, women had to sit down and wait to be served. And for wine drinkers who couldn't wait, the 1982 vintage of New Beaujolais was delivered by the Red Devils, who parachuted down from 2,000 feet with the bottles strapped to their legs. The big aerial attraction at Farnborough was the Skyship 500. It cost just over £1 million and could carry 10 passengers at a top speed of 70 miles an hour. and was being called the transport of the future. The transport of the present was the helicopter, and the world's first international helicopter show took place at Middle Wallop. The first man to fly a helicopter solo across the Atlantic was Dick Smith from Australia. He arrived in Scotland to a royal welcome and went on to fly around the world.
I brought this all the way across the Atlantic for you.
And another first for Daniel and Christopher Smith, Britain's first test tube twins. Their parents from Stockport were clearly delighted.
Delighted, absolutely.
Are you going to have more?
Oh, I don't know. Ask Stuart, not me.
And a 9-month-old baby proved that conducting a full symphony orchestra could be child's play. More incredible was the case of 2-year-old Darrell Lovelace, who drank a lethal dose of weed killer while no one was looking. The doctors said it was enough to kill an adult, but he pulled through. 86 children took to the catwalk to show off the latest French fashions. Some strode on, bursting with confidence. Others looked a bit lost and clearly needed a helping hand, while some got so carried away with it, they nearly went over the edge. No, it's not Lion-O, but one of the characters in the first ever strip cartoon version of Macbeth. Pupils were divided in their opinion of this unfamiliar version of a classroom text.
Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand?
Out, done, Spot, out, I say. 1, 2, why, then 'tis time to do it.
Because I think it's just something like Tintin. You know, it comes across to me like that.
Most kids, when they get to a certain age, they're drawn to comics and pictures. And when they see it in a book or a monologue or something like that, they aren't drawn to it. They'll remember it more with the pictures and things like that.
That may have been what children were reading, but one of the big draws of the year was at Wembley. The largest lineup of models ever held in Britain attracted 80,000 visitors, including a former Prime Minister, Lord Wilson, who was there to open the show. The models range from the sophisticated to the very simple. The big box office success of the year was E.T. Steven Spielberg's film about the extraterrestrial creature made hundreds of millions of pounds, not just from people who went to see it, but from a whole new industry of E.T. merchandise. The space industry proved a winner for 18-year-old Todd Nelson from Minnesota. He won a NASA competition for a space shuttle experiment. His suggestion was to see how a collection of moths, bees, and unhatched flies would behave in the weightless conditions of space. Another children's competition was for new projects to save energy. Mrs. Thatcher went to meet the finalists.
When was it built?
1967. If you turn on the hot tap without the plug-in, no water will come out. You've got to have the plug-in before the hot water will come out. So,
and you find that saves a tremendous amount of hot water, and at home it would save a lot of bills for parents, and at school it saves a lot of money, and therefore releases money to be spent on other things.
Britain's North Sea oil production was getting into top gear. This was the giant Magnus rig, twice as tall as the Dome of St. Paul's. It was the biggest and last oil platform ever built in Britain, pumping out 120,000 barrels of oil a day. Its supporting cables were blown apart at regular intervals as it was slowly towed out to sea. But the search was also on for alternative forms of energy, including wave power. The government were presented with several schemes to generate electricity from the waves around Britain's coastline. And one of Britain's biggest ever projects to control the tides became operational. The Thames Barrier, designed to stop London flooding, was tested for the first time. The barrier took 8 years to build at a cost of £435 million. It can be raised in 30 minutes to stand 50 feet above the normal water level. Another London landmark seemed in danger, according to this report from Phil Roman.
St Paul's has stood here for the last 300 years, but for the past 30 years, the volume of traffic and heavy lorries going past has been shaking the foundations. So now the GLC say there's no alternative. It has to be moved, both for its own safety and to improve the flow of traffic.
The scheme never came off, but then the story did go out on April Fool's Day. A much more serious and genuine worry was over whooping cough. 1982 saw a whooping cough epidemic in Britain. Many fewer parents were having their children vaccinated because of fears that the vaccine could cause brain damage. And another worry was over the increasing number of attacks on children.
Say no to strangers.
Jump in, I'll give you a lift. Come on, jump in.
Say no to strangers.
You haven't told me your name yet.
Teresa Mills.
Teresa. That's a nice name.
Wrong.
That humid summer produced quite a few scares. The worst plague of fleas to bite Britain for years was spreading across the country, and before people had left off itching and scratching, they were beset by wild hamsters. The hamsters had bred from escaped pets and turned out to be a real pest. Summer was followed by one of the wettest Octobers on record, and the result was an umbrella shortage. For the manufacturers, though, the profits were pouring in.
The important thing is to be British and not panic. So we didn't. Thank you. And all was well.
Prince Charles wasn't talking about the weather, but the raising of Henry VIII's warship the Mary Rose, which sank in 1545. The salvage nearly ended in disaster. Another wreck that surfaced was Britain's first Royal Navy submarine, 69 years after she went down. Holland 1 sank near the Eddystone Lighthouse on her way to the Breakers Yard. But the most remarkable survival was Barry Sheen's legs. The former world motorcycle champion was back on his bike only 2 months after an accident that nearly killed him. Finally, it was goodbye to one of British Rail's most famous diesel locomotives, the Deltic. And goodbye, too, to the traditional inland telegram, which ended after 140 years. The service, which conveyed good and bad news to so many for so long, was losing too much money. So the once familiar telegraph boy on his bicycle disappeared. The telegram's now been replaced by the tele-message.
So, that's it, your personal birthday video. We hope you'll want to keep it and come back to it as you grow older, like a family photo album, and maybe even one day show it to your children and grandchildren. As you've seen, lots of important events were happening around the world, but to you, the most important thing was that it was the year when you were born.